Hello, everyone. Today we're going to look at a talk given by Dr. Dustin Louie, an educational researcher from Canada and a professor at the University of Calgary Faculty of Education who specializes in Indigenous scholarship. And what exactly is Dr. Louie a doctor of? Well, that took a surprising amount of digging, because I can find almost no references to his curriculum vitae. But in what scant information I could come up with, and so far as I can tell, he has a PhD in educational research. And what exactly is educational research? Well, that's a bit difficult to define, as the doctorate program at the University of Calgary, which, again, given the thin information on our speaker's CV, I can only assume is where he attained his PhD, the program is divided into 6 differing specializations. I have no idea which of these pertains to our speaker, but the one that jumped out to me, and seemed the most fitting, given to what we are about to listen to, was the one called Curriculum and Learning. Graduate students will have opportunities to understand how interpretive disciplines in curriculum and emergent theories of learning offer meaningful and potential transforming ways of thinking about schooling, knowledge, research, teaching and learning, and the nature of pedagogical relationships. Curriculum and learning encompasses issues of content, context, and teaching in both formal and non-formal educational settings. Students can explore contemporary themes of curriculum and learning, including issues of globalization, gender, culture, power, traditions of wisdom, ecology and education, and the ideas and practices of social justice examined from social, cultural, historical, political, discursive, ecological, and other interpretive perspectives. So, with all of that as preamble, let us begin.
Looking at social justice, I sort of teach a couple of different classes at the university. One of them is in power and privilege, and the other one is in First Nation Métis Indian education. So specifically, I'm going to look from the Indigenous perspective today, but all this work is transferable into the other work that I do as well.
The Indigenous perspective. Indigenous people are a hive mind? Maybe that's a stupid question. I mean, I am not Canadian, after all.
So the main problem that we come up against when we're teaching some of these courses to pre-service teachers are that first is that they aren't willing to recognize their own prejudices, they instead deny them. So a lot of the research shows that everybody holds these based on socialization. So we have certain expectations of our students based on their gender, based on their race, based on their religion, based on their ability, based on a number of different factors. And the biggest problem is so many of our student teachers and people in general deny this rather than looking deeper at it.
Yes, prospective teachers are all inherently sinful. They look upon their students with judgmental eyes because of what the students are, not who the students are. We know this thinking to be true of everyone. And it is by not accepting and confessing these sinful thoughts that these teachers perpetuate the work of the devil.
So they say, I was raised to treat everybody the same. I don't see color, I don't see gender, but we know inherently in the ways we, meet other people, the ways in which we communicate with other people, that happens, in a way that we don't recognize oftentimes. So the ways in which oppression often plays out between teacher and student is unrecognized by the person who's perpetrating it against the student in the first place. So that's the first huge barrier we have to overcome in these classes.
Yes, the effects of the devil's influence upon our minds is subtle, dare I say, practically invisible. But it is this translucent motive and intent that in and of itself shows just how insidious and prevalent this evil is. And it is an evil perpetuated by the teacher onto their students. Won't somebody please think of the children?
The second significant barrier is that people often just want to be told what to do. So if I'm teaching FNMI education, they're like, just tell me what to do with these students. Give me the answers and I'll do it. And they really just want to be shown what to do because they're so afraid of doing the wrong thing.
Afraid of doing the wrong thing? Well, why would they at all be afraid of that? I mean, it's not like they're being told that, without guidance, they're going to be unknowingly imposing subtle and subconscious racist and sexist judgments upon their own students or anything. You must be talking nonsense.
So these two aspects are the biggest sort of barriers that we're seeing every day within the classes that we're teaching. So historically, I would say the problem was just the denial of this existing in the first place. So the denial of oppression of different groups of people, assuming that everybody is treated the same. But now it's on the individual level is the problem. How can we implicate individuals in what's happening and get them to understand and look inward in order to make those significant changes in what needs to be done?
How can we implicate people? Now, maybe it's just me, but most often when I hear that someone has been implicated in something, it involves a crime. It is so odd that I would think that.
So in order to address this, I've adopted a couple of different frameworks in my teaching that I find are effective ways of not only getting people to recognize the ways in which they're implicated in these problems, but how we can actually begin to address this. Because I think so often getting from theory to practice, getting that area of practice is so difficult for so many people. And they see theories in classrooms and they think it's just something you're going to read in a book and you're never going to actually bring into the classroom. So what I've done is I've sort of amalgamated two theories, one Western, one Indigenous, into a way that I think is make these accessible and show people an actual roadmap into ways they can take this into their classroom.
You've amalgamated two theories, one Western and one Indigenous. Okay. I am intrigued to know what this theoretical cultural appropriation looks like.
So the first one that I use is Horkheimer's 3 Assumptions of Critical Theory. I know just hearing that makes people want to run for the door because it doesn't sound very exciting, but I promise you I'll make it I'll talk about it in an accessible manner, hopefully quickly. So Horkheimer's theory has 3 assumptions. It's written a little more complicated than this, but fundamentally argues that 1, the world's inherently unequal. Even though we consider Western democracies to be equal places, there's actually significant inequality based on a number of factors, whether they be gender, orientation, race, any number of categories. So that's the first one. So we often don't get much pushback from students from this. There's an understanding that certain people have advantages, certain people have disadvantages.
Number 1, life is not fair. Got it.
So that's the first aspect. The second is that the ways in which oppression plays out is often invisible or normalized within society. So you often don't recognize when somebody's being oppressed if you're from the privileged group. So the ways in which these play out in society are happening all the time and they're often invisible. And if they're not invisible, they're so common in our society that it becomes normal and it's not even recognized by somebody. So you can think of this as the massive overrepresentation of African Americans in prison, the massive overrepresentations of Indigenous peoples in non-academic courses, the overrepresentation of women, as being under-recognized within the workforce. All these things are happening and normalized within our society so that people often don't recognize them.
Number 2, oppression is invisible to the oppressors, but visible to the oppressed. So in concert with number 1, life is not fair because invisible oppressions are unwittingly being imposed by the oppressors onto the oppressed. Got it.
The third aspect of critical theory is it's not enough to know about these first 2 aspects, you need to actually do something about it. So doing something about it doesn't just mean doing something to the inequality, it means addressing the way that it's normalized or not recognized within our society as well.
And number 3, do something to address the fact that life isn't fair and to dispel the invisible oppressions. Even though the disparities between different people and different groups are and have been a fact of life since time began. Even though these oppressions are invisible and can only be pointed out by those seemingly with the most to gain by claiming victimhood. Even though all of these behaviors are inherent to all of us, whether we admit to them or not. Number 3 sounds like a never-ending quest for redemption. It is so odd that I would think of it like that.
So within my classes, I talk to my students and say, throughout this class, you're going to be able to start recognizing the inequality, you're going to start recognizing the normalization, and then realize the ways in which you can address both of those aspects. Because you can't do something about these issues until you understand the reason that it's happening in the first place. How is it, infused into the systemic functions in our society? All these different aspects. You can't just do something about it without understanding these issues deeply first. And that's such a big barrier to our students.
Yes. In order to oppose the invisible, subtle, subconscious forces that are plaguing society, those forces that are unseen and unacknowledged by those so steeped in sin as to deny they exist, in order for the children to fight against this evil, the mechanisms of this grand conspiracy must be explained and made plain. Otherwise, the children might never come to see it for themselves, because it is invisible and insidious, and only the enlightened few can detect and expose it. And the children must be reached with this knowledge early on, lest they themselves unwittingly become agents of oppression.
So the additional framework that I add on to that is Leroy Littlebear, who's a Blackfoot scholar, and he argues two concepts that are sort of constant within Indigenous knowledge. One of them is the idea of constant flux, which argues that the world is constantly changing. So the knowledge we have today isn't necessarily going to be useful tomorrow because the world is changing beneath our feet all the time. So within Indigenous cultures and Indigenous worldviews, this is commonly accepted, that we need to understand knowledge from a cyclical perspective rather than a linear. When we learn something, we can't just move on from it. We have to come back and revisit it and see if it still makes sense in the world in which we're living in.
Concept number 1, the methodical re-examination of accepted practices. Got it.
So that's one concept that Littlebear talks about, is constant flux. The second is renewal. So connected with constant flux, we need to constantly be rechecking our knowledge all the time. So something we've learned, we need to recheck it to see if it still makes sense.
I thought that was part of concept number 1.
When we learn something, we can't just move on from it. We have to come back and revisit it and see if it still makes sense in the world in which we're living in.
Right. Okay, so I'm confused. Either there aren't two concepts from Littlebear, or you accidentally smush them both together into one statement. I'll extend the benefit of the doubt that it's the latter.
Compared to, we might have a new worldview since we've first learned that knowledge in the first place. The external world might have changed in the interim. So it's really important to renew that knowledge. So within the three aspects of Horkheimer's critical theory, you can use Littlebear to recheck that knowledge over and over again.
Sure, taking things for granted and without question can and will lead to social and intellectual stagnation. Sort of like accepting the notion of being told that my thoughts and actions are inherently wicked, and that this wickedness is invisible to me, but not to you, because you know how all other people think without needing to have met them. I find myself questioning that idea rather than taking your word for it.
So if you understand the inequality that happens today, and you understand the ways in which it's normalized today, and then what you need to do, you need to recheck that in a couple of years, because the way that inequality might be happening might be totally different than it was, a few years ago.
Yes, it is a never-ending struggle, because the devil never operates by the same playbook for very long. Understand that this is an eternal fight between your invisible instincts and the correct way of behaving.
So these are the three primary models that I use within my class, or the two primary models I use within my class to teach. So today I'll be talking about it through a lens of Indigenous education, but you can do this same practice looking at the ways that LGBTQ populations are oppressed, or the ways that people with different abilities are oppressed in schools. So you can use this model. This really has a transferability into other areas as well.
Yes, this mode of thinking is applicable to all areas of life, not just to education. You might even say that it is the answer to all of life's disparities, and the guiding light on how to be a better person than all who would deny the wisdom of this revelation.
So I wanted to think of a specific example and show you the ways in which we can use this process in the classroom, or really with anybody. So the example that I'm going to use is Indigenous knowledge is not being respected within the realm of education. So this is both a historic and a contemporary experience. So historically, we understand that Indigenous knowledges weren't honored because the residential school era pretty much points to that. So fundamentally what the residential schools were arguing was that Indigenous knowledge isn't good enough. Being who you are isn't good enough to function within this society. So who you are is problematic, so we need to change you into something else.
Okay, I guess I would need to know what the term Indigenous knowledge means. Because if he means an understanding of the world based on cultural or spiritual beliefs versus empirical data and science, then yes, I can see how Indigenous knowledge would be challenged. But taking that to mean that the individual is thus devalued and problematic seems like an internalized leap of interpretation.
So a lot of people say that, the primary function of residential schools was to assimilate. There's a longer conversation that shows that actually wasn't the case. It was just an attempt to destroy culture rather than to assimilate.
That is an awfully serious accusation, but it's part of a larger conversation that we're just not going to have. I just have to take your word for it. If you say so.
But based on that idea of Western culture was telling Indigenous people by this system that they weren't good enough and their knowledge systems had no use in contemporary society. So that's how it manifested itself historically. So in contemporary society, that idea still is involved in our school system. So the idea that Indigenous knowledge doesn't have any value is shown in which, Indigenous ways of knowing aren't inherent within the curriculum.
Well, are the Indigenous ways of knowing based on science and reality, or on a cultural belief and practice? Does the concept of the separation of church and state mean anything here? And even if we're not explicitly talking religion or spirituality, why would one culture be elevated over any other in schools, Indigenous or not?
So not just content. So often when we think of Indigenous knowledges, we think of content. Let's teach about residential schools. Let's teach about these different eras. So that's only one small piece of Indigenous ways of knowing. So we need to take Indigenous pedagogies, Indigenous ways of communicating, Indigenous concepts, and those need to be infused within the education system. So the fact that that's not being done now, there's a push for it to happen now, but if you go to most school systems, that's not happening in a meaningful way in most cases. So that's another. They're reaffirming again that Indigenous ways of knowing aren't valuable, and there's nothing we have to learn from you, and there's nothing that you can bring into the school system that's any value.
Examples, please. These generalities are beginning to give me a headache.
So this is playing out over and over again in schools all over the place. It's playing out in the institution that we're in right now. So within the Faculty of Education, we have 7 Indigenous scholars now, so we're pushing back against the system in which we operate, and there's a great deal of resistance, and not from people who. When we think of resistance to these movements, we think of people who are sort of closed-minded and not open to new ways of thinking, but we're so entrenched within the socialization that we've grown up in that there's such a resistance to Indigenous ways of knowing that we're finding at every level.
New ways of thinking. Well, Indigenous knowledge and Indigenous ways of knowing sound more like archaic ways of thinking. And if so, I can see why there would be resistance to making them a part of the general curriculum. But then, not having been given any examples of what our speaker is talking about so far, I am honestly grasping at straws here.
So, taking this idea of this denial of Indigenous knowledges and take it through the frameworks that I mentioned. So, if we think of the first way, the ways that inequality happens, so I gave some examples of that.
You have given us no examples. You have provided concepts and broad assertions.
So we see inequality within the residential school system. We see it in the contemporary education system where we're not bringing in Indigenous knowledges into our classroom on a daily basis. So that's one way that inequality is happening at a very visible level within our school system.
Okay, is not teaching creationism in school an example of inequality? Is not extolling the virtues of phrenology an injustice of education?
So the second way, so if we think of the second aspect of critical theory, which I said was the normalization or the invisibility of this inequality happening in the first place, the way that that's happening now is we're seeing huge amounts of Indigenous students pushed into non-academic streams. So in BC, 38% of non-academic students are Indigenous, despite being about 11% of the population.
What is a non-academic student? Do you mean someone focusing on vocational studies, like learning a trade, plumbing, auto mechanics, that sort of thing? Are those statistics a result of discrimination, or is focusing on non-academic disciplines a result of Indigenous culture or economic forces? If I need to help support my family in the short term, which makes more sense? Pursuing an expensive degree in psychology, or learning a trade from which I can start making an income right away?
So they're teachers have an assumption when the students come in that these Indigenous students aren't capable of learning because this is what's been taught to us and this is what's been socialized to us.
So again, you know how teachers think and what they think when it comes to Indigenous students. Got it.
So when we talk about oppression, it's important to recognize that most of it isn't happening overtly or consciously. Those teachers aren't saying, as soon as these Indigenous students come in, I'm going to push them to non-academic streams. It's that they've been told and reinforced over and over again within Canadian society that these students aren't capable of learning.
So again, you know how teachers think and what they think, but you also know that teachers are not even aware of how they are thinking or what they are thinking. Got it.
This has been, passed through the media. This has been passed through stories that are told. So there's this real assumption that's often unconscious for so many people that these students can't succeed. So when they push them into non-academic streams, it's not thinking that they're doing it intentionally. It's that socialization and that unconscious process that's happening where if a student starts struggling, they don't try to help them succeed within that system because there's already an assumption they're not going to be able to succeed. So why put that further effort in? So on the other hand, if there's another student, maybe a non-Indigenous student, who there's an assumption that they can't succeed, if they start struggling, that teacher puts in the extra effort, figures out how they may learn more effectively and sort of push them to succeed. So they're getting that extra support because there's those assumptions that they have the capability of succeeding.
All Canadian teachers are racist. Got it.
So this is an invisible way that this happens. So the fact that there's this huge overrepresentation of Indigenous students within non-academic streams, that seems natural because our assumptions on Indigenous people's inability to succeed within the education system. So it's not something we pay a great deal of attention to. So this is happening in so many different aspects of the school system in which Indigenous students are being oppressed.
Examples? Do you have any examples? Please?
So the same goes for other students of color. So there's research out of Texas that shows that zero tolerance policies, which are pretty much policies that say, if you do these certain actions, you're suspended no matter what, or you're expelled no matter what. So they did research in Texas on zero tolerance and found that African American students were expelled at a rate of 90% for their first offense. And all other students were expelled at a rate of 25% for their first offense. So this is the same thing playing out. There's an assumption that these students can't succeed, or there's an assumption of guilt of these students before anything even happens, and that's how it plays out within that system. So we're seeing those same invisibility or normalization of oppression playing out in multiple systems in multiple ways.
Okay, finally something specific to look at. A Texas study on zero tolerance. Now, in order to avoid making this video ridiculously long, I will stipulate to the numbers generated by the study, showing Black and Hispanic students being more often subject to the consequences of zero tolerance policies than white students. But what the study does not say is, were these disciplinary actions unwarranted? The implication by our speaker is that the administration of the policy is inherently racist, but it could also be that Black and Hispanic youth simply end up breaking policy more often than others. The study does not prove one or the other. And this is not an endorsement of zero tolerance policies on my part. I understand the idea is to create an even playing field of expectations for students, so no favoritism is showed. But such things should, in my opinion, be based on the circumstances on a case-by-case basis to some degree. But, moving on.
So then, if we think of the third aspect of critical theory, all right, what can we do to start addressing these first two issues? Both the inequality, so the lack of representation of Indigenous knowledge within the school system, and then the invisibility of it within how are we pushing these students out of the school system, basically. We're telling them they're not real students and they're not being valued here, and we're pushing them out of the system. How can we address both of these aspects as teachers?
Yes, I am dying to know what you think teachers should do in this regard, given that you have already disparaged teachers who look for guidance on the fear they might do something wrong.
The second significant barrier is that people often just want to be told what to do. So if I'm teaching FNMI education, they're like, just tell me what to do with these students. Give me the answers and I'll do it. And they really just want to be shown what to do because they're so afraid of doing the wrong thing.
So, what guidance do you have for teachers so that they don't keep doing the wrong things you know they are doing unconsciously?
So the first aspect is we can open up the school system to be not just a Western European system. So how can we bring in and value knowledge of people outside of the system in which has been normalized? How can we bring in Indigenous people and value them within that school system and not just tokenize them there? How can we bring in more teachers into the school system? And then how, as non-Indigenous teachers, can we model for our students the importance of pursuing knowledge outside of the Western canon? So that's one of the biggest things that teachers can do, is model that interest and respect and reverence in other cultures beyond their own, because the system right now isn't doing that in any way.
What do you mean? If you're talking about teaching the history of Indigenous people as pertains to Canadian history, I don't see how that should be an issue. But if you're talking about teaching Indigenous knowledge and knowing alongside science and philosophy as being equitable in value and accuracy, then tell me again why creationism should not also be taught. Why shouldn't the phlogiston theory of fire be standard material in the classroom?
So addressing the second aspect of critical theory, how can we address that? Well, we can begin to reflect upon our actions. At the end of the day, we can think of the ways we reacted to different students' difficulties that they were running up against or their successes that they're having. If an Indigenous student succeeds, are we overpraising them because we're seeing them as an anomaly to the rest of the community? If an Indigenous student isn't succeeding, did we give them the attention that we would give to other students at the same time? So that goes back to that aspect of, instead of denying our prejudices, trying to recognize them, because that's how real change happens. We begin to look inwards and we're able to recognize the ways in which we're participating in this oppression that happens within the system.
Yes. It's not a question as to whether teachers are being discriminatory. It's just a matter of how teachers are being discriminatory. And the way to manage this is to second-guess every thought or feeling or reaction they might have to an Indigenous student's performance. Are you giving them praise? Are you sure it's enough praise? Or is your praise just your overcompensating for your own innate low opinion of Indigenous students, and you're only putting on a show? In short, you need to wallow in self-doubt if you want to be interacting with Indigenous students correctly.
So then if we think of adding on the elements of Leroy Little Bear and we start to renew our knowledge over and over again, I think an example of my experiences in education can represent that.
What? Are we actually going to get some examples now? Yay!
So when I was in high school, there was not a single representation of Indigenous peoples, despite my school being 50% Indigenous and 50% non-Indigenous. So in the entire 12 years of high school I went to in northern British Columbia, we didn't have a single discussion about Indigenous peoples or Indigenous knowledges.
Again, can you give any examples on what you mean by Indigenous knowledge? I cannot make an informed assessment of these injustices you're describing unless I know what it is you are talking about.
And during this whole time, there was sort of constant violence going on between those two communities.
What? Which two communities? What kind of violence? What are you talking about?
So never discussed in our school, and they're missing that opportunity. So using Little Bear's renewal and constant flux, back then if I was a teacher and I was looking at how is inequality happening and how is it normalized, it would be on a very overt level if I was looking at that school system in the late 90s. So then if I renewed my knowledge in 2017 and then understand that there's changes within the world and changes within the school system, if I'm renewing that knowledge, then I'm going to start recognizing different inequalities that are happening.
So wait, in the 1990s, Indigenous knowledge was not being discussed in any way, and this was an overt inequality. But renewing your knowledge in 2017, you would recognize different inequalities that are happening. Inequalities that are not overt now? I don't understand.
So these might be being discussed, but they might be discussed at a very trivial level. So you might be only discussing the surface level differences between the cultures. So you're saying, well, these are the foods that they eat, and these are the foods that we eat. These are some of the clothes they wear, and these are some of the clothes we wear.
Well, what should a public education system be doing otherwise? Why should Indigenous culture be weighted with more value than any other? Why should schools give higher priority to a single culture? How is that any different from favoring a specific religion?
So the problem nowadays might be, yeah, we're just not getting to any depth and real depth of what it means to be an Indigenous person. What are some ways in which they communicate? What are some different ways that we define who we are as people? I think a good example of this is, what if you say the word family in your class, there's going to be 25 different interpretations of that word. So we base ours on an assumption that everybody has the same Western view of that word, when really different cultures are going to have a completely different perspective of that word within your classroom.
So teachers need to be wary of how any particular word might be interpreted. In fact, any of 25 different ways, lest they find themselves being culturally insensitive. Got it.
So I think that renewal of knowledge is such an important factor, because we can't just become complacent and think we've figured things out. So that's really an additional problem with the class, is that at the end, some of the students leave feeling good about themselves. They've gone through that difficult period of looking inward, understanding they're complicit in some of the ways in which oppression plays out systemically and individually, but then they leave and think that, all right, well, I know about Indigenous people now, I can go and educate within those communities. But instead, you need that constant renewal of knowledge, or else you're never going to really understand these processes. It's really a lifelong undertaking.
A lifelong undertaking. Non-Indigenous students need to embark on a lifelong undertaking to understand Indigenous culture. Why? What if they don't want to? What if it has nothing to do with them and they aren't interested? Why is forcing a particular culture on students over any other not in itself an inequality of education?
So in the end of the program, the thing I really stress is, like, the only way we make real change is to address the truth. Address the truth of the education system we're in, and address the truth in the way we've been socialized in our society. So it's such a natural reaction to resist this sort of approach, because we don't like to implicate ourselves, because we like to think of ourselves as good people, think of ourselves as open-minded people, and think of ourselves as being raised, in an equal environment.
But the truth is, we are not good people. We are not open-minded. We need to implicate ourselves in thought crimes and wrong thinking, because we're all guilty of this, whether we know it or not. Because our speaker knows it, and that is proof enough.
But it's until we start implicating ourselves and understanding our own subconscious and understanding the ways we've been socialized that we can begin to make real change. And then in addition, I also stress to my students, we can't become mired in guilt. When we start recognizing the ways in which we, contribute to the system, we can't just feel guilty and become paralyzed.
Guilty? Why should they feel guilty? They're just unconsciously, unknowingly, invisibly oppressing and devaluing people on the basis of their ethnicity. What's to feel guilty about?
We really need to act on this. Understanding this isn't a reason just to sit there and feel sorry for yourself and feel bad about yourself. It's really a call to action in my perspective. So I think that's where we can take this work out. So again, a lot of times these frameworks, I think, can seem so distant and academic.
No worries there. I did not get a sense that these frameworks have much of an academic basis at all.
But I think if you think of these three aspects of critical theory and think of this renewal and constant flux that Little Bear talks about, I think they're a really practical roadmap that I've used in my classrooms to help people understand these issues, and I think they can be translated into any other area. So, thank you.
So, what have we learned? 1. Indigenous knowledge, whatever that is, should be taught alongside Western academics. 2. Teachers, and society at large, are all inherently discriminatory towards Indigenous students, and they all must confess, they all must acknowledge their invisible and unconscious opinions before they can address them. 3. Indigenous students are inherently victims, and wherever they find themselves academically or emotionally is the fault of their culture being oppressed by the education system and not at all a result of their own choices or personal merit. Wow. As with all of these examinations of education, I feel so much smarter now. As always, thank you for watching.